Welcome back to The Explainer. Joining me is a lecturer of history at the Ateneo de Manila. He's a PhD candidate whose area of scholarship is the legacy of EDSA. ANC followers will also recognize him as one of the original champions of the debate program, Square Off. So welcome to the show, Leloy.
Hello, Manolo.
Okay, so you're the academic guest. Let's start with the definition of terms. We've been using the term people power. Now, how would you define it for our audience?
I think it's very difficult to define people power because a lot of people have invested certain meanings of people power and derive certain privileges from certain meanings of people power. So, for example, in the Inquirer a few years back, people who were working with house building projects of God Kalinga were saying that that was a new form of people power, that instead of protesting in the streets, we'd rather build houses, and that's a new form of people power. But I think what unites all these definitions of people power is that, of course, it's outside the formal institutions, and that it is done autonomously by a group of people who are not working with the government.
So, first of all, it's aimed at pressuring the government outside of what is considered to be the government's sort of home court advantage in the institutions. Yes. We're also assuming, I suppose, that it is non-violent and peaceful in orientation, although it can lead to, in many ways, provocations of the authorities.
I agree.
Okay, so having defined that, we have the dilemma in the Philippines, right, where periodically things bog down and people take to the streets. Starting with our own experience, is this a demonstration of the weakness of democracy, or is it part of the sort of blooming of democracy? How do we approach that?
Well, I'm not sure people take to the streets as much as they did before. I think there is a sense of popular disillusionment right now, actually, with going to the streets because they don't know what that causes. They don't know the effects of that anymore. And I think to a large extent, Arroyo administration has taken advantage of that. That's why she survived for so long. But I think that we still need to remember that there is a value to civic engagement, to going out in the streets as a point of socialization for many people. Because a lot of the people, for example, right now who are working in NGOs, who are working in party lists, a lot of them started out in the first quarter storm or in EDSA, and they got their first political socialization there. And I think that's an important thing to note.
But it's interesting, you pointed out this question of not taking a leap into the dark, sort of. And yet you have other countries, for example, the West is a very good example, particularly in the light of the Iraq war and that sort of thing, where it's really an intrinsic part of how the body politic works, that when people oppose their government, they will engage in these large symbolic actions. And we saw it in Spain, it brought down a government, but in other places, like in London, it didn't. So why then is there no angst-ridden debate there about taking to the streets, and here it has to result in specific regime change even?
I don't know, maybe it's because of the history of People Power 1 and People Power 2. And I think that you pointed out a very interesting problem there, that people don't understand that even if you don't necessarily overthrow a regime, popular protest has an effect. So for example, the Carper Law, how was that passed? That was passed through farmers picketing the Congress, basically, and putting pressure on their congressmen. And now I think hopefully the Freedom of Information Bill will be passed, but that almost didn't get passed. And the only reason why we're going to have a kind of special session for that is because people protested. So just putting yourself out there and telling your politicians this is what you want, that makes a difference. Because ultimately politicians still like to think that they listen to people, because they still like to think that they're serving an electorate.
Now, the politicians will also argue, on the other hand, that while those who take to the streets argue that there is, shall we say, the court of public opinion, where issues can be tried and where verdicts can be handed down on leaders, the leaders themselves will say, but this is mob rule. It's neither informed nor within organized institutions. Now, is this simply because officials have a vested interest, or do they even have a point?
I think they don't have a point, actually. I think that one of the core tenets of democracy, as the economist Joseph Stiglitz says, is actually transparency. That if government officials don't work transparently and people don't know what they're doing, it's very difficult to hold them accountable. Now, I'm not saying that citizens should speak in the halls of Congress all the time, but definitely citizens should be able to speak to their legislators. And if they don't like what's happening in the halls of Congress, then by all means picket the Congress.
Now, moving further afield to even just our part of the world. After EDSA 1, we had people power. There was EDSA 2, which became problematic.
Yeah.
Again, it was neither an outright revolution, but not quite a transition within the rules. And people started pointing out that you had a similar situation taking place in Thailand. That basically here and in Thailand, we had populist leaders who enjoyed public support from the dispossessed, the poor, and the urban, the rural, versus the middle class and upper classes in the cities who just didn't want them.
Yeah. I think that's largely what explains EDSA 3 in the context of the Philippines. I actually am one of the people, I don't pass off EDSA 3 as just a bunch of lumpen proletariat being egged on by ERAP to protest. I think there's something there that we really do need to acknowledge. And it's because class warfare still largely works in the Philippines. And you'll see this in many other cases of people power in the Philippines. I don't think that People Power 1, for example, was the first case of people power. For me, the first case was the 1953 election of Ramon Magsaysay. That was the first case of people power because you had all these groups working towards the election of Magsaysay. You had the first NAMFREL, you had groups associated with the Lions Club. And basically what that did was that allowed for Magsaysay to get elected largely through the help of these middle-class groups. But while some people say that solved the peasant revolt, it took you how many years? Less than 10 years, or a little bit more than 10 years, for the CPP-NPA to eventually emerge, which shows you that people power, unless it resolves these class tensions, will not necessarily work in smoothing out social conflict, particularly class conflict in the Philippines.
Well, what happened? Therefore, the first question that arises then is, if it remains peaceful and non-violent, then therefore, what could bring a government down or frighten a government fearful of the next election into making concessions is simply numbers and a certain moral outrage on the part of the population. But when the soldiers respond, and this was the case in 2001 and also the continuing case in Thailand, it's a very different dynamic, at which point does it become actually an opening for an undemocratic
so some people could argue that, because what happens after a situation like that where the revolution is half-baked, and I think you mentioned this a while ago, is that you have a kind of balancing act that you need to do. And this happened in the Aquino administration, for instance. For example, after every coup, Aquino would fire people who were associated with the left. So it was after a coup when she fired Pepe Diokno, for example, or when she abolished the Philippine Commission